Our massive bombs hit exactly the right spot at each target and worked perfectly. That's a direct line from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth about the strikes on Iran's nuclear program. And it tells you almost everything you need to know about the fierce, unresolved argument sitting underneath one of the most audacious military operations in modern American history. Welcome back, everybody. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird demonstration pilot, and longtime commercial airline pilot. And today, we're breaking down Operation Midnight Hammer, the night 7 American B-2 stealth bombers flew halfway around the world to drop the largest conventional bomb in the U.S. arsenal on Iran's most protected nuclear sites. The strike that got called obliteration by one side and a partial temporary setback by the other. And somehow, more than a year later, nobody in Washington has actually settled which version is true.
Stick around because by the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why a bomb the size of a school bus got built in the first place, why a squadron of decoy bombers flew toward Guam while the real strike package went the other way entirely, and why the Pentagon's own intelligence arm ended up publicly contradicting the President of the United States within 72 hours of the mission being declared a total success. I want to walk you through exactly what's confirmed here because there's a lot of loud talk online about Iran's nuclear program getting erased overnight, and that talk does not match what independent reporting, satellite imagery, and the government's own internal assessments are actually saying. So let's get into it, sourced step by step.
First, understand what this bomb actually is, because the weapon itself is basically the whole story here. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, weighs roughly 30,000 pounds, which is about the weight of a fully loaded school bus, and it had never once been used in an actual combat operation before this night. Only the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber can carry it, and even the B-2 can only carry 2 at a time, one under each wing, which tells you immediately how much aircraft you need just to deliver a handful of these things anywhere on Earth. According to the Pentagon's own briefing after the fact, 7 B-2 bombers flew the entire mission directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri all the way to Iran and back, without landing once, refueling in the air multiple times along the way. That's one of the longest combat sorties American bomber crews have flown since right after September 11th. And while that main strike package was quietly crossing the Pacific and looping toward the actual target, a second, separate group of B-2s flew out over open ocean toward Guam as a deliberate decoy, drawing exactly the kind of public attention you'd expect, with plane spotters and open-source flight trackers picking up the Guam-bound bombers and reporting on them for hours, while the real mission slipped past almost entirely unnoticed until it was already over. If you wanted a textbook example of operational deception actually working as designed in the age of everyone having a flight tracking app on their phone, this is basically it. So here's the actual timeline of what happened that night, and I want to go through this carefully because the sequence matters just as much as the target list. In the early hours of Sunday, local time in Iran, which was Saturday evening back on the East Coast, the strike package crossed into Iranian airspace after 4th and 5th generation fighter escorts, most likely a mix of F-16 and F-35, according to defense officials, swept ahead of the bombers looking for enemy aircraft and surface-to-air missile threats. Roughly 25 minutes after the operation began inside Iranian airspace, the lead B-2 dropped the first 2 massive ordnance penetrators on what General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described at the Pentagon briefing as the first of several aim points at the Fordo facility. Over the course of that same short window, a total of 14 MOPs were dropped across 2 target areas, Fordo and Natanz, both of them core pillars of Iran's uranium enrichment program, with Fordo in particular built deep into a mountainside specifically to survive exactly this kind of attack. At the same time, a U.S. submarine positioned somewhere inside Central Command's area of responsibility fired more than 24 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles at the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Complex, a site that includes a uranium conversion plant and tunnel entrances believed to store enriched material, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency's own Director General, Rafael Grossi. Because the Tomahawks travel slower and had farther to go, they actually landed on target after the bunker busters had already hit Fordo and Natanz, even though they were launched earlier in the sequence. General Kane told reporters the U.S. military was, in his words, unaware of any shots fired at the strike package on the way in or on the way out, adding that Iran's fighters never got airborne and its surface-to-air missile systems never appeared to detect the bombers at all, meaning the entire mission preserved the element of surprise from start to finish. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a strategic standpoint, and this is the part of the story I think most casual coverage misses entirely. Within hours of the strike, President Trump addressed the nation directly from the White House, flanked by Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Hegseth, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and he described the operation as a spectacular military success that had completely and totally destroyed Iran's nuclear enrichment capability. Hegseth, standing at the Pentagon podium the following day, used the word obliterated to describe what had happened to Iran's nuclear ambitions, a word that would end up doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting in the days that followed. That's the headline version almost everybody heard first, and for a lot of people, that's genuinely where the story ended. But here's the detail that a lot of the more sensational coverage online conveniently leaves out. Within about 72 hours, CNN reported, citing multiple people familiar with a preliminary assessment, that the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's own internal intelligence arm, had produced a battle damage assessment based on U.S. Central Command's analysis, concluding that the strikes had not destroyed the core components of Iran's nuclear program. According to that reporting, the centrifuges at the affected sites were described by one source as largely intact, and separate intelligence indicated that much of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium had actually been moved out of the sites before the bombs ever fell, possibly relocated to other undisclosed facilities Iran maintains. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and Reuters all independently reported versions of that same DIA assessment shortly afterward, which is the kind of multi-outlet independent confirmation that tends to mean the underlying reporting is solid, even when the conclusion is politically inconvenient for the people who just held a victory briefing 48 hours earlier. Let's talk about that clash directly, because it's genuinely one of the most consequential parts of this entire story, and it deserves careful treatment rather than being flattened into a simple yes or no. The Trump administration did not accept that early assessment quietly. Pentagon Press Secretary Sean Parnell publicly maintained days later that the sites had been completely obliterated, without offering further detail on how that specific conclusion had been reached, according to reporting at the time. Hegseth went further in a statement provided to Reuters, insisting that, based on everything he had personally seen, the bombing campaign had obliterated Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons, and arguing that the impact of those bombs was buried under a mountain of rubble inside Iran, framing anyone questioning the mission's success as effectively trying to undermine the president. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard said days after that new intelligence confirmed Iran's nuclear facilities had been destroyed, a notably firmer position than the earlier assessment her own intelligence community had produced weeks before the strikes even happened, when it had assessed that Iran was not actively building a nuclear weapon, even while its enriched uranium stockpile sat at unprecedented levels for a country without one. Vice President Vance, when pressed directly by NBC's Kristen Welker the day after the strike about whether he was confident the enrichment sites were destroyed, gave a noticeably more careful answer than Hegseth's, saying he wouldn't get into sensitive intelligence details, but that he felt very confident Iran's weapons development had been substantially delayed, which is a meaningfully different claim than obliterated, and it's worth sitting with that gap between two senior officials from the same administration describing the same event in two different registers within 24 hours of each other. Then, roughly a week later, the Pentagon shifted its public language again. According to Al Jazeera's reporting on a subsequent Pentagon announcement, officials said their intelligence assessments now showed the strikes had degraded Iran's nuclear program by somewhere between 1 and 2 years, a formulation that's notably more measured than obliterated, but still considerably more aggressive than the original DIA estimate of a setback measured in months rather than years. A separate Israeli intelligence assessment, which Trump read aloud in public remarks, concluded that the strike on Fordo specifically had destroyed the site's critical infrastructure and rendered the enrichment facility inoperable, and that combined with earlier Israeli strikes on other parts of Iran's military nuclear program, the overall setback amounted to many years rather than months. One source familiar with the original DIA report told Reuters that the assessment was not universally accepted inside the intelligence community and had generated real internal disagreement, which tells you this wasn't a simple case of one report being definitively right and everyone else being wrong. It was multiple credible institutions, using different methodologies and different sourcing, landing in genuinely different places on the same underlying question. and all of them presumably had access to at least some of the same satellite imagery. I want to pause here and give you my own honest analysis, as someone who's had to think through exactly this kind of battle damage assessment problem in a military planning context. And I'll flag clearly that this next part is my opinion, not reported fact. Assessing the actual effect of a deep penetrating weapon like the MOP from the outside is genuinely one of the hardest intelligence problems there is, because the entire point of a bunker buster is that its damage happens underground, invisible to the satellite cameras that everyone, including me, keeps citing throughout this video. You can absolutely confirm entry points, collapsed access tunnels, and surface damage from imagery, and outside researchers and satellite imagery firms did exactly that within days. What you cannot confirm from a satellite photo is what actually happened to a centrifuge cascade sitting under a mountain of rock and rubble, and that gap between what's visible and what actually matters is precisely where this entire obliterated versus a few months argument has been living ever since. From my own experience thinking through mission effectiveness as a pilot, the honest answer to "did this work" is almost never a clean yes or no in the days immediately following a strike like this. It's a number that keeps shifting as more sources of information, human intelligence, signals intercepts, and eventually on-the-ground access, if that ever happens, get folded into the picture over the following weeks and months. Let's talk about the secrecy and deception piece specifically, because it's genuinely one of the most striking operational details in this entire story, and it's arguably underappreciated compared to how much attention the bomb itself got. General Kane told reporters that this was a highly classified mission, with very few people in Washington knowing the timing or the actual nature of the plan in advance. A detail that matters because it tells you the administration deliberately kept the circle of people briefed on the real target incredibly small, even while public attention was being pointed somewhere else entirely. The decoy B-2s heading toward Guam weren't some minor footnote either. Open-source flight trackers and aviation enthusiasts picked up on bombers apparently heading west across the Pacific hours before the strike, and that specific detail got reported publicly well before anyone outside a very small circle understood that the actual strike package was headed the opposite direction, toward Iran. That's a genuinely effective piece of old-fashioned operational deception, executed in an era where basically anyone with a laptop and a flight tracking website can watch military aircraft move around the globe in something close to real time. And it worked well enough that Iran's own air defense systems, according to Kane, never appeared to detect the real package coming in at all. Quick gut check before we keep going. Drop a comment right now with just the single word "months" if you think the Defense Intelligence Agency's original, more cautious assessment turns out closer to the truth over time, or years if you think the Pentagon's later, more aggressive estimate holds up as more information eventually comes out. I genuinely want to see where this audience lands on that before I share my own prediction later on in this video. I also want to walk you through what the IAEA specifically has said, because their read on this carries a different kind of weight than either side of the domestic political argument, given that their entire job is independent nuclear verification rather than defending any single government's messaging. Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed that buildings at the Isfahan site were struck, including some directly tied to the uranium conversion process, and he specifically noted that entrances to tunnels used for storing enriched material appeared to have been hit as well. That's a notably careful, technical description. Entrances appeared to have been hit, rather than a sweeping claim in either direction about the broader program being finished or barely dented. It's worth sitting with that phrasing for a second, because an organization whose entire credibility depends on being seen as neutral by essentially every government on Earth has strong institutional incentives to describe exactly what its inspectors and imagery analysts can actually verify, and to studiously avoid the kind of maximalist language that both Washington and Tehran have each reached for at different points in this story, for their own separate reasons. Now let's talk about the broader strategic picture here, because I think this is the part of the story that tends to get lost underneath the obliterated versus not obliterated argument, and it's genuinely worth understanding on its own terms. This strike didn't happen in isolation. It came in the middle of an active air war between Israel and Iran that had already been running for close to 2 weeks by the time American bombers actually entered the picture, with Israel having already struck a range of Iranian military and nuclear-adjacent targets on its own before the United States committed its own aircraft directly. The decision to bring in the one weapon in the American arsenal specifically designed to reach deeply buried, hardened targets like Fordo was, by every account from officials at the time, a recognition that Israel simply did not possess a weapon capable of reaching that particular target on its own, no matter how many strikes it ran against Iran's other sites. That's arguably the single clearest piece of evidence that this wasn't just American saber-rattling for its own sake. It was a specific capability gap that only the United States could close, and closing it required committing an aircraft and a weapon that had never been used in combat before, which is not a decision any administration makes lightly, regardless of what political framing gets applied to it afterward in the following days and weeks. Let's also talk about the part of this story that I think deserves more attention than the strike statistics and the political argument over wording, and that's what this specific operation might mean for how future conflicts like this one get fought going forward. Before this night, the massive ordnance penetrator existed purely as a deterrent, a weapon everyone knew the United States possessed, but that had never actually been dropped on anything in an actual war. The moment it gets used operationally for the first time, it stops being a theoretical capability sitting in an inventory list and becomes a demonstrated real-world fact that every other country with deeply buried, hardened facilities of its own now has to account for in its own defensive planning. North Korea's underground facilities, other nations pursuing similar deeply buried programs, all of them just watched a live demonstration of exactly what this specific weapon can and cannot do against exactly this kind of target, which is a genuinely different strategic reality than the one that existed the week before this operation happened. I think that ripple effect, the message this sends to every other government on Earth thinking about burying its most sensitive facilities under a mountain, is honestly a bigger long-term story than the specific percentage setback to Iran's program that everyone in Washington kept arguing about in the days immediately after. I want to spend a minute on what I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in all of this, and that's the sheer number of people whose entire professional lives were built around these three facilities, completely separate from the geopolitics and the intelligence assessments. Every scientist and technician who spent years of their career working inside Fordo or Natanz or Isfahan. Every family in the surrounding towns whose local economy depended in some way on those facilities operating. All of that sits directly underneath a strike that multiple governments openly debated for years as a strategic option before it actually happened. I think it's easy, when you're walking through target sets and battle damage assessments like I've been doing through most of this video, to lose sight of the fact that these were functioning workplaces employing real people right up until the moment the first bomb actually landed, and that whatever setback number eventually turns out to be accurate, months, a couple of years, or somewhere in between, real careers and real communities absorbed the actual physical and economic consequences of that number in ways that don't show up cleanly in any Pentagon briefing slide. Now, let me give you my honest read on where this whole story actually stands. And again, I'll flag this section clearly as my own analysis rather than settled fact. I think the most likely truth here sits somewhere between the two poles that got argued about so loudly in public. The strikes clearly did real, physically significant damage. Multiple independent satellite imagery analyses, the IAEA's own careful language about tunnel entrances being hit, and even the more cautious officials inside the administration itself all agree on that much. What I don't think holds up, at least based on everything publicly reported so far, is the idea that this single night of strikes definitively and permanently ended Iran's nuclear ambitions in the way the most triumphant public statements suggested in the first 48 hours. Programs like this one are built around redundancy specifically because governments that pursue them anticipate exactly this kind of attack, which is part of why intelligence about material moved out before the strikes matters as much as the visible damage to the buildings that got hit. I think the honest, most likely outcome, and I want to stress this is speculation on my part, is that this operation bought real time, somewhere in the range that different assessments have suggested, without being the final chapter of this specific story. Whether that time gets used by Iran to rebuild in some form, or whether it gets used by diplomats on multiple sides to actually reach some kind of longer-term settlement, is genuinely the open question that matters most going forward, and it's one that neither triumphant press conferences nor leaked intelligence assessments have actually answered yet. If you're finding this kind of detailed source breakdown useful, and you want the real story instead of whatever oversimplified headline is trending this week, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because I'm going to keep tracking this one specifically as more information eventually gets declassified or independently confirmed. This is genuinely one of the most consequential single military operations in recent memory, and it deserves ongoing, careful coverage rather than a one-time video that gets forgotten the moment the next headline shows up. So here's where things actually stand with Operation Midnight Hammer. As of the most recent confirmed reporting, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 massive ordnance penetrators on the Fordo and Natanz nuclear sites, while a submarine fired more than 24 Tomahawk missiles at the Isfahan complex, in a mission that achieved complete tactical surprise, according to the Pentagon's own account. The administration's public language moved from obliterated in the first 48 hours to a Pentagon estimate of 1 to 2 years of setback roughly a week later, while the Defense Intelligence Agency's original, more cautious internal assessment described a setback measured in months rather than years, with real, publicly reported disagreement inside the intelligence community about which estimate holds up. The IAEA independently confirmed physical damage to buildings and tunnel entrances at Isfahan without endorsing either side's broader claims about the program's overall status. And a meaningful amount of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, according to multiple independent reports, was reportedly moved out of the targeted sites before the bombs ever landed. Operation Midnight Hammer absolutely happened, and it absolutely did real damage. Whether it did decisive, permanent damage is a question that, as of everything actually confirmed and reported, genuinely remains open more than a year later. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through. I know this was a deep dive, but this strike is genuinely one of the most important single events to understand if you want to actually make sense of where the broader standoff with Iran's nuclear program goes next, rather than just reacting to whatever framing shows up in your feed today. Drop a comment and let me know whether you think history ends up calling this operation a decisive success or a temporary setback that Iran eventually works around. I read every single one of these, and I'm genuinely curious what you all think given everything we just walked through together. And if you called it earlier with your one-word months or years comment, I want to know if this deep dive changed your mind at all. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch it the moment something actually changes on this specific story, and I'll see you in the next one.